Very sorry to interrupt, but if you are a fan of The Spectator, then I'd love to recommend The Spectator's Best of Notes On, a new book edited by me, William Moore, and Gus Carter, and beautifully illustrated by Michael Heath. Best of Notes On takes The Spectator's funniest, sharpest, and most fascinating pieces on miscellaneous topics. So from Rod Liddell on quince, to Tom Holland on hedgehogs, to Julie Burchill on cocaine, Best of Notes On is sharp, unpredictable, and often very funny. It's the perfect gift this Christmas, so if you would like to order a copy, go to spectator.co.uk/shop to get a 10% discount if you're a Spectator subscriber.
Millions of women owe their careers, in a sense, to Margaret Thatcher because she opened the door, which was not open before, and she proved that it could be done.
Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. I'm delighted to be joined by two historians, Charles Moore, who's written the authoritative series on the Iron Lady, and Tina Gaudoin, who wrote the Incidental Feminist about the life of Margaret Thatcher. Now, Tina, I was reading your book over the weekend, and one of the opening chapters you talk about the glamour of Margaret Thatcher, and you agree with Charles on this point in his series. So tell us what you mean by that.
Well, I do agree with Charles because, of course, Charles was the first person to pick up on this, really. So my perspective on it, and I've taken some of this from Charles, and I've interviewed Charles on this, is that she was fascinated from a very early age with film and Hollywood glamour. Later on, that translated into a fascination for handsome, tall, upstanding gentlemen, including Ronald Reagan and Gorby. So, and in the interim period, what I think is very interesting is that her fascination for fashion was, in a sense, her way of dealing with the world, with the pressures of her role and her job. And if you look, as Charles and I both have, at the letters between her and her sister Muriel, you can clearly see that she constantly references what she's worn, and she lists what she's worn almost religiously and what she plans to wear. And throughout the rest of her life, she was very, very focused on her appearance. And she kind of used it, I think, I don't know what you think, Charles, as a way of dealing with the high pressure role that she was in.
I would agree with Tina. The way I put it in my biography, at least I think that's what I said in the biography, is that she regarded her clothing rather like a medieval knight regarded his armour. So it had to be both beautiful and make a good impression and practical. It had to repel attack. And she had to go into battle with it. And that's very important for her. And it's particularly important for her because just as a knight's armour is a symbol of masculinity, among other things, she wished to have a symbol of femininity, but femininity that could many things. And one of them was this teaching you about clothes and, you know, how to remake them, make them, refurbish them. And interestingly, it fits into her thing about economy, because she wanted to look her best. And as she used to later say, look my best for Britain, sort of her great phrases. But she also always very conscious of budget. And in this letters to her sister, that one of the reasons she's writing to her sister about clothes is that they shared the same wardrobe.
Yes.
They didn't have a separate wardrobe. So there's a question of, can I have the highwayman coat this week, for example? And Margaret is usually getting the better of the deal because she was doing more sort of performance, and therefore, even when very young, and therefore wearing smart clothes more. So I think poor Muriel was not getting the clothes quite so often.
You dedicate the book to Dorothy Hodgkin, of course, the only British woman to win a Nobel Prize for Science. And I think Margaret Thatcher famously said she was more proud of being the first Prime Minister with a science degree rather than being the first female Prime Minister.
Right.
I mean, how important was that scientific training and that kind of sense of being in from a STEM background as opposed to her sex and driving her politics over her career?
Well, when I talked to Norman Tebbit about this, he was really interesting. He said that he thought that she judged, or she made all of her decisions based around her scientific background. And it was, in a sense, the rigour that she applied to every political issue and decision she made. In fact, he said she judged them religiously and politically, and also from a class angle. That was his perspective on, you know, there was the three things that he thought were most important about her application in terms of the political process.
Charles, I mean, obviously it's been a difficult time for many in the Conservative Party, having left office last year. I think many disappointed expectations that the lengthy period of government didn't see anything similar to what the Thatcher government achieved. You write in the book, you said she wasn't a great institutionalist when she comes in 79. She didn't sort of rewire the whole state, do a sort of Maurice Hankey style cabinet office, but she's got that great character, which I think Tina talks about there, the sort of scientific training which she uses to bring to bear. And she has this wonderfully disarming mechanism, wonderfully alarming mechanism perhaps, of turning up to ministries unannounced. And sort of, how did she ensure the machinery of the state worked for her?
I think by giving it a good kick rather than trying to rebuild it. Politicians, whenever you talk about machinery of government, which they sometimes do, Starmer did quite a lot about it before he became Prime Minister, it's actually very, very boring and also oddly undirected. It matters terribly, but they're not really the right people to talk about it. What they need to do is show what they want and then drive the system to bring that about. And so Mrs. Thatcher was a revolutionary in her zeal for change, but she wasn't an institutional revolutionary. She didn't want to take apart the whole British system of doing things. She wanted to galvanise it and simplify it and, if you like, purify it of too many things that had accumulated. But if you start doing machinery of government stuff, you run out of time apart from anything else.
It's really interesting. You talk about in the book about how she was quite iterative and how she would go through and sort of line by line analyse every single thing. I mean, what lessons are should the right take today from that period in government? I mean, you mentioned before, I think you did an IEA interview where you said that the quality of civil servants perhaps wasn't what it was 30, 40 years ago.
Yeah.
How much can be taken from her and how much has really changed?
Well, one thing can be taken for it, you could see how she did it, because in a way you couldn't now as Prime Minister because it was written on paper, as you're describing. So what the archives show is all the papers that cross her desk and what she did with them. And you can tell she's reading them or alternatively not reading them because she underlines a lot. And a wiggly line means disapproval and a flat line means approval. And her way of expressing her views, apart from that, was to write them on what she's reading, not to write a separate memo. Her private secretaries would then take these and translate them into separate memos, which went down the line as sort of orders and directions. And so you can really see what her mind is, and then you can see how it works through the system. And that's it's very useful for historians, but it's also an intrinsically good way of governing because people can understand what the source of a thought is. And now in the internet age and also in the age of sofa government, which tries to avoid the internet age, nobody knows who's saying what really. And it's all sort of whisper. It's become, in an odd way, in the super technological world, it's become more like a medieval court. And it was sort of clearer and more rational in her time. And the scientific aspect is very important, as mentioned, but so is her attitude to law. She's a great believer in the rule of law, and she was also a lawyer. She said that when she was at a young girl in Grantham, she learnt the laws of God. And when she was an undergraduate reading chemistry, she learnt the laws of science. And when she was at the bar, she learnt the laws of man. And she wanted to combine all those three things, and the common word there is laws.
Tina, in your book, you write that when she entered Parliament in 1959, that great election where I think it was a majority of 100 for Harold Macmillan, she was one of just 25 women to have ever been elected to the House of Commons. In Charles' book, he talks, for instance, how there was a sort of dry economic dining club with the likes of Cecil Parkinson in 74, and she was excluded initially from those dinners because it was thought she would ruin the clubability of it. How does she take those kind of slights initially and joining such a heavily male club as it was in 59 and throughout much of her time in Parliament, certainly in the Commons?
I think she ignored all of that. I think she felt that to make a fuss about it, I mean, I don't know what Charles thinks about this, but I think she thought and continued to think until the end that if she made a fuss about the opposite sex, she would diminish her own progress, really. So I think she felt that it was best ignored and best for her to prove herself, which she felt, I think, all along she had to do, really.
I think that's right. And I think she, but there were two things. She wanted to... She actually liked flattering men. So though she was very tough, she would make men feel good about being men. And that was a very important part of her.
But she also liked men flattering her.
She
Charles.
certainly did, yes. Yeah, well, those things tend to be mutual, don't they?
They do,
when they
right.
work, when they work.
You should know, Charles.
And she... the other thing was that she wanted to conquer, rather than... She knew that if she asserted women's stuff, what she called the woman stuff. Yeah. This would alienate at least half the potential electorate. She was very concerned with the condition of women, but what she thought was that she had to conquer. So rather than getting pigeonholed into women's stuff, she asked herself, what are men most interested in politics? And the answer is power and money and war. So I, Margaret Thatcher, are going to master those subjects. I'm actually very interested in health and education as well, but I'm going to say less about that. Those are what I'm going to be in charge of. So she did. And so, first of all, that proves that a woman can do it. And secondly, it sort of outclasses the men.
Yes.
And therefore it changes the whole picture much more than a sort of, quote, capital F feminist. I mean, I think Tina's right that in a sense she was a feminist, but it was part of the skill of her feminism was that she didn't say she was. In fact, she said she wasn't.
And I think I've got a quote in my book which you gave me, which I think was something along the lines of, she thought the women's stuff was a diversion from the sort of real stuff that needed to go before that, really.
First of all, it was a priority because of the state of the country and the state of the world. But also, it was a diversion which was designed, in political terms, it was a diversion because it was designed as a sort of cul-de-sac for women in politics. It wasn't that the issues didn't matter.
Exactly.
But I mean, she was, even if she didn't regard herself as a sort of exceptional novelty, Tina, you write in your book about how there was an immense fascination with the pop culture world of her. Vivienne Westwood abhorred her politics but admired her style.
Yeah.
Just talk us through that, because she was so, obviously, 11 and a half years, immense amount of time every single day of the 1980s, but she was so emblematic of that age and inspired so much, and still continues to, for instance, I'm told, inspire drag queens to this day. There's a Margaret Thatcher, Queen of Soho, there to refrigerate. Why has she had such an enduring effect?
Well, I think, first of all, I think I say in the book that I asked the question, was she the grit, the creative grit in the oyster of Britain at that time? And I'm going to show my age now, but also forget some of the pop stars. But during that time, there was a great upsurge, if you talk to anyone, of creativity during that time. And one of the things that she did, which proved to be really successful, was the Enterprise Allowance Scheme.
Yes,
is that
correct,
what it was
yeah.
called? Wherein people could be given a grant as long as they had a business plan, and they were very small businesses given grants, and people like Tracy Emin came out of that. I mean, it's extraordinary. And then there was a lot of pop culture of resistance, but also pop culture of celebration.
They probably got her grants as well.
Yeah, they probably did, right? But it was a very sort of glossy time. So we had the New Romantics, which Charles probably liked, and people like George Michael, Madonna, Basquiat across the Atlantic. It was just a very fertile time for creativity, and I think we can't help but think that Thatcherism and Reaganism had a lot to do with that.
The title of my second volume is called Everything She Wants, which is a song from Wham.
You're going to hum that for us?
I think Oasis got that. So it wasn't, Charles, I just wonder, sort of drawing this towards a close, but you've written columns this year talking about the split in the American right and the British right, and of course one of the reasons why Thatcherism established such an intellectual hegemony was because, of course, she had a soulmate across the Atlantic, the world's most powerful economy, acting in lockstep. That seems to be very different from now. I mean, sort of just talk us through what that means in terms of Thatcherism's legacy, where much of the American new right, less so on this side of the pond, but America seems to reject a lot of what she stood for.
It is more difficult now, and partly to do with Trump, but there are other factors as well. There's a sort of so-called national conservatism grown up, which is not directly contradictory to Thatcherism, but is different from it. Actually, she had quite a lot of national conservatism in her blood. She was very keen on fighting for Britain first, that sort of thing. But she did also strongly believe in free markets, and she wanted to free up the world. She thought it was very important that she didn't want what we call globalization, but she wanted the victory for freedom in the world. And with Reagan brought it about with the end of the Cold War. And there seems to have been a certain amount of conservatism which goes against that. So you get strands in MAGA and J.D. Vance, for example, who actually seem to think that Putin's quite a good thing, and that somehow freedom doesn't matter. And the rhetorical device there is to say, well, there's free speech is in a worse state in Britain than it is in Russia, which I'm not happy with the state of free speech in Britain, but there's absolute rubbish to say that it's worse than in Russia. And that's wrong and difficult and really quite alarming, I think. However, whenever I do talks in America or to America, there's a big following there. And I think that if you learn the lessons, they're not out of date, really. They do apply now. In fact, they apply more in some ways in global affairs even than they did, well, certainly more than they did 25 years ago, possibly even more than 50 years ago, because the threat from tyrannous regimes is actually greater in a way than in the Cold War. And what we have now, which we didn't have then, interestingly, is an alliance between China and Russia. Because in the Cold War, despite being both communist horrors, they hated one another so much that they couldn't unite, China and the Soviet. And now they're pretty close, and they're against us. They are the enemy. And then you stick in Iran, North Korea, and you've really got a pretty alarming cocktail where you do need defense and ideological and political alliances to work. And I'm frightened by the aspects of American conservatism that don't seem to see why alliances matter.
This is a final question, Tina. I wonder, I mean, your book came out this year, and, there'll be many women watching this who maybe, don't remember, 35 years and what it was like, etc. Why should they continue to be interested, even inspired by the story of Margaret Thatcher and what she did in office?
Well, one of the reasons I wanted to write about Margaret Thatcher was the point that she, without her, in fact, she normalised female power, let's put it that way. Without her, we would have had no model. I mean, maybe a role model would have come along later on, but by the very dint of the fact that she normalised female power, what it looked like to be a leader, what it looked like to be the leader of a global power. In a sense, we all stand on her shoulders because of that. Every single woman it's an extreme thing to say, the developed world, but, millions of women owe their careers, in a sense, to Margaret Thatcher because she opened the door, which was not open before, and she proved that it could be done.
The famous thing that shows that, which I've come across several individual examples of, is that when she resigned in 1990, quite a lot of children said to their parents, Mummy, in Britain, can a man be Prime Minister?
Well, on that note, thank you very much, Charles. Thank you, Tina.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching Spectator TV.